Elijah was a bright, curious boy with big dreams. At just 12 years old, he had always wondered what it felt like to fly in first class. He had seen it in movies. Big, comfortable seats, fancy meals, and people being treated like royalty. Now, for the first time in his life, he was going to experience it himself. His mother, a hard-working nurse, had surprised him with the first-class ticket as a reward for his excellent grades. She had worked extra shifts to afford it, and when she handed him the ticket, her eyes were full of pride. "You deserve this, Elijah," she had said with a warm smile. "Enjoy every moment." Elijah couldn't stop smiling as he arrived at the airport. He wore his best clothes, a clean polo shirt, neatly pressed jeans, and his favorite sneakers. His mother had always taught him that no matter where he went, he should always present himself with confidence. He held his backpack tightly, feeling both excited and nervous about traveling alone for the first time. At the check-in counter, he handed over his ticket, half expecting the agent to tell them there was a mistake. But the woman smiled and gave him his boarding pass without question. "Enjoy your flight, young man," she said, and Elijah grinned. As he made his way through security and to the gate, he watched other passengers. Most of them were adults, dressed in suits or expensive outfits, talking into their phones or reading newspapers. He felt a little out of place, but reminded himself that he belonged here. His ticket said first class, just like everyone else's. Finally, boarding began. When they called for first-class passengers, Elijah proudly stepped forward, holding out his pass. The gate agent barely looked at him before letting him through. His heart pounded with excitement as he walked down the jet bridge, feeling the cool rush of air from the plane's entrance. Stepping inside, he was in awe. The first-class cabin was just as amazing as he had imagined. The seats were huge, soft, and spacious, with blankets and pillows neatly placed on them. A flight attendant greeted him with a polite smile, but her eyes flickered with surprise when she saw him. Elijah found his seat near the window and placed his backpack beside him. He ran his fingers over the armrest, amazed by the buttons that could turn the seat into a bed. He couldn't wait to settle in and enjoy the flight. But just as he was about to put on his headphones, a different flight attendant approached. She had a serious expression and looked at him carefully. "Excuse me, young man," she said. "Can I see your ticket again?" Elijah blinked in confusion. "Sure," he said, pulling it out of his pocket and handing it over. She studied it for a moment, her lips pressing together. Then, in a voice that sounded too polite, she said, "There might be a mistake. I need to check something." Elijah's excitement wavered. Something didn't feel right. Elijah sat in his seat, waiting as the flight attendant looked at his ticket. He didn't understand what was wrong. He had checked his ticket many times before coming on the plane. It clearly said first class, so why was she acting like there was a problem? She handed the ticket back to him, but didn't leave. Instead, she gave him a small smile that didn't seem real. "Are you sure this is your seat, young man?" she asked. Elijah nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. My mom bought it for me." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to step in. Then she let out a small sigh. "Let me check something," she said before walking away. Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Other passengers were watching now. A man in a dark business suit sitting across from him raised an eyebrow. An older woman nearby glanced at him before looking away. He could feel their silent stares, and suddenly, the excitement he had felt earlier started to fade. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned, this time with another crew member, a supervisor. The supervisor, a tall man with neatly combed hair, looked down at Elijah with a polite but firm expression. "Sir, we may have a seating issue," he said in a formal voice. "Can I see your ticket again?" Elijah swallowed hard but kept his head up. He handed over his ticket once more. The supervisor took a moment to examine it, then exchanged a glance with the flight attendant. "This is a first-class ticket," the man said slowly. "I know," Elijah said, trying not to sound nervous. "That's my seat." The flight attendant's lips tightened. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked. "Yes, my mom dropped me off at the airport," Elijah answered honestly. The supervisor gave a small nod, but the flight attendant still didn't seem satisfied. She looked over at another passenger, a businessman sitting nearby, who had been watching the whole thing. The man chuckled and shook his head. Maybe he got confused and took the wrong seat. He muttered just loud enough for Elijah to hear. Elijah felt heat rise to his face. "I didn't take the wrong seat," he said firmly. "This is my seat." The flight attendant folded her arms. "Well, young man, we have to confirm everything before takeoff. Why don't you come with us for a moment while we sort this out?" Elijah's heart pounded. Why was this happening? No one else was being asked to prove they belonged in first class. He looked around, hoping someone would speak up, but the other passengers just watched in silence. He clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. His mother had worked hard for this ticket. He had every right to be here. He took a deep breath and said, "I'm not moving. This is my seat." The flight attendant's smile vanished. The supervisor frowned. The businessman scoffed. And Elijah suddenly realized this wasn't just a simple mistake. Elijah sat firmly in his seat, gripping the armrest as the flight attendant and supervisor stood in front of him. He could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on him, their whispers barely above a murmur. His heart pounded, but he refused to move. The flight attendant let out a small sigh, exchanging a glance with the supervisor. Then, in a louder voice, she said, "Sir, we need to resolve this issue before takeoff. Please come with us so we can check your ticket properly." Elijah shook his head. "You already checked it. I belong here." A few people in the first-class cabin shifted uncomfortably. A woman sitting nearby glanced between Elijah and the crew, looking unsure. The businessman, the same one who had scoffed earlier, sighed dramatically. "This is ridiculous. Just move the kid to economy and let's go." Elijah's face felt hot, but he kept his voice steady. "My mom paid for this seat. I'm not moving." The supervisor's expression tightened. He leaned down slightly, lowering his voice, but his tone was firm. "Look, young man, we don't want to cause a scene. Let's just step aside and figure this out, all right?" Elijah realized what they were doing. They wanted him to move so they wouldn't have to deal with this in front of the other passengers. But he wasn't the one making a mistake, they were. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice louder now. "Why do I have to move?" The whispers around him grew louder. Some passengers looked away, pretending not to hear. Others watched with mild curiosity, as if waiting to see how it would play out. The flight attendant straightened up, clearly growing impatient. "Sir, if you do not comply, we may have to call security." At the word security, Elijah's stomach twisted. They were really going to remove him, like he had done something bad. His fingers tightened around his backpack. A woman sitting a few rows ahead suddenly spoke up. "Excuse me," she said. She was dressed in a stylish blazer and had a sharp, confident voice. "I saw him board. He had a first-class ticket, just like the rest of us. Why are you questioning him so much?" The flight attendant hesitated. "We just need to confirm." The woman raised an eyebrow. "You already checked his ticket twice. What exactly needs confirmation?" Elijah felt a spark of hope, but before anyone could say more, the businessman huffed. "Oh, come on. Let's not turn this into something bigger than it is. The airline is just making sure everything's in order." The woman turned to him. "Would you be okay if this happened to your child?" The businessman didn't answer. He only shook his head and looked away. Elijah swallowed hard. His hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from frustration. He had never felt so humiliated in his life. He wanted to call his mother, but he also didn't want her to worry. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled out his phone. If they wanted to escalate this, so could he. Elijah's hands trembled as he unlocked his phone. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't just sit there and let them take his seat. His mother had worked too hard for this, and he wasn't going to let them treat him unfairly. The flight attendant and the supervisor stood over him, waiting for him to move. The businessman across the aisle was shaking his head like Elijah was the problem. The woman who had spoken up earlier was watching closely, her eyes filled with concern. Taking a deep breath, Elijah pressed the call button and put the phone to his ear. His mother answered almost immediately. "Elijah, what's wrong?" His voice was shaky, but he kept it steady. "Mom, they're saying I can't sit in first class. They keep checking my ticket, and now they're saying they might call security." There was a pause. Then his mother's voice turned sharp. "What? Why?" "I don't know," Elijah said, his chest tightening. "They said they need to confirm something, but they already checked my ticket. They won't let me stay." His mother didn't hesitate. "Give the phone to the flight attendant," she said. Elijah lifted his head. "My mom wants to talk to you," he told the flight attendant, holding out the phone. The woman hesitated, but then took the phone. "Hello, ma'am. I understand your concern, but we're just trying to clear up." She stopped mid-sentence. Her face changed slightly as Elijah's mother spoke. The confident expression she had before started to fade. She swallowed, nodding slowly, even though no one could see her on the phone. "Yes, I understand." "No, ma'am, I didn't mean to." Elijah watched as the flight attendant's posture straightened. Her eyes darted to the supervisor, then to Elijah. "Yes, I'll let him be seated," she finally said before handing the phone back to him. "Elijah," his mother said quickly, "stay in your seat. I'm making another call. Everything will be fine." Elijah nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Okay, Mom." The flight attendant cleared her throat and forced a smile. "It looks like everything is in order after all," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Please enjoy your flight." But Elijah wasn't fooled. She wasn't happy. She had been told to stop, and she didn't like it. The businessman across from him muttered something under his breath and went back to reading his newspaper. Elijah put his phone in his pocket, his heart still beating fast. His mother said she was making another call. Who was she calling? What was she going to do? A few minutes later, the flight supervisor's radio crackled. He listened for a second, his face turning pale. Then, without a word, he hurried toward the front of the plane. Elijah took a deep breath. Something was happening. And this time, it wasn't against him. It was for him. The flight supervisor walked quickly toward the front of the plane, pressing his radio closer to his ear. His face had changed. No longer confident, no longer in control. Something had happened, and Elijah could tell it was big. Elijah sat still, gripping the armrest. His mother had said she was making another call. But to whom? What was going on? The passengers around him had noticed the sudden shift. The businessman, who had been so sure Elijah didn't belong, was now looking up with mild curiosity. The woman who had defended Elijah earlier glanced toward the front of the plane, sensing something was wrong. The flight attendant who had questioned Elijah stood frozen in place. She glanced at the supervisor, waiting for a signal on what to do next. But he was gone, heading straight for the cockpit. A few moments later, the captain himself stepped out. He was an older man with sharp eyes and a calm presence. He spoke briefly with the flight supervisor, who nodded nervously and gestured toward Elijah. Elijah swallowed. Why was the captain looking at him? Then, before anyone could say another word, a voice came over the loudspeaker. It was the gate agent from the airport. Her voice was clear and professional, but there was a slight tension in it. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight delay before departure. First-class passengers, please remain in your seats as we finalize some important matters." A murmur spread through the cabin. People shifted in their seats, confused. The businessman sighed loudly. "Oh, what now?" he muttered. The captain nodded at the flight supervisor, who quickly turned to the flight attendant. "Come with me," he said quietly. She blinked in surprise but followed him toward the front of the plane. Elijah's heart pounded. He didn't know what was happening, but he had a feeling it had something to do with him. A few minutes later, the flight supervisor returned, his face pale. He walked straight up to Elijah, his hands clasped together. The entire first-class cabin was watching now. "Sir," the supervisor said carefully, "I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. You are, of course, welcome to remain in your seat." Elijah blinked. "I know," he said firmly. The supervisor's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "If there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask." Elijah didn't say anything. He simply sat back in his seat. The businessman let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. The woman who had spoken up earlier smiled slightly, as if she knew something the others didn't. Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from his mother. "Your father knows. He's handling it." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. His father. But how? Then it hit him. His father wasn't just someone with connections. His father owned the airline. Elijah stared at the text from his mother, his heart skipping a beat. His father knew. What did that even mean? His father owned the airline. It was hard to wrap his mind around the idea. He'd always known his father was important, but this was something else entirely. As the realization sunk in, Elijah leaned back in his seat, trying to process everything. The flight had been delayed, and people around him were talking in hushed tones. The businessman who had scoffed at him earlier was now scrolling through his phone, muttering under his breath. Elijah could feel the stares, but he wasn't bothered anymore. Something was happening, and it wasn't in their favor, it was in his. A few moments passed, and the flight attendant came back, walking briskly down the aisle. She avoided Elijah's gaze, her face a mixture of guilt and confusion. She had clearly been given new instructions, but it wasn't hard to tell that she wasn't happy about them. The supervisor reappeared shortly after, his expression no longer serious but more anxious. He walked past Elijah without saying a word, glancing briefly at the other passengers who were still eyeing him with curiosity. Then, to Elijah's surprise, the captain entered the cabin again. This time, there was a different energy about him. He was no longer the calm, neutral figure. Now he looked almost worried. Elijah wasn't sure what was happening, but he could tell things were escalating. The captain stopped near Elijah's seat. "Excuse me, young man," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of caution. Elijah turned his head to face him, feeling a new wave of uncertainty. "Yes?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rush of thoughts swirling in his mind. "I need to apologize on behalf of the airline. We've just been informed that there's been some confusion," the captain said, choosing his words carefully. "You are, of course, more than welcome to stay in first class." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "I never left," he said softly but firmly. The captain nodded, taking a deep breath as if preparing to say something difficult. "We've received instructions from the top," he continued, his voice low. "The misunderstanding earlier was not your fault, Elijah. In fact, it was a matter of protocol and a lack of understanding from the staff." Elijah was still trying to piece everything together. Why was the captain telling him all this now? Before Elijah could ask any more questions, the captain leaned in slightly. "I'm sure you've realized by now that your father is the owner of this airline." Elijah felt his breath catch in his throat. He had no idea how the captain could have known. His father's name wasn't something Elijah often used, especially not around strangers. "Yes," the captain continued, his voice lowering further. "Your father owns this airline, and it's his decision to ensure that you are treated with the respect you deserve. We've made some mistakes today, and I assure you they won't happen again." Elijah's eyes widened as everything started to make sense. His father had found out. And now, the airline was acting swiftly to correct the wrong. It was a strange feeling. One part relief, one part confusion. The captain straightened up, his expression softening. "I just wanted you to know that this situation is being handled, and we'll make sure this never happens again." Elijah nodded slowly. He felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. His father owned the airline, and now people were scrambling to make things right. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an awkward reminder that some people still judged others based on things they couldn't control. The flight attendant returned moments later with a new tray of drinks, this time with a smile. She placed a glass of juice in front of Elijah. "On behalf of the airline, please accept this as a token of our apology," she said, her voice more polite than before. Elijah glanced at her but didn't speak. The entire situation still felt surreal. It was all happening so fast. But one thing was clear. His father's influence had turned the tide. Elijah stared at the text from his mother, his heart skipping a beat. His father knew. What did that even mean? His father owned the airline. It was hard to wrap his mind around the idea. He'd always known his father was important, but this was something else entirely. As the realization sunk in, Elijah leaned back in his seat, trying to process everything. The flight had been delayed, and people around him were talking in hushed tones. The businessman who had scoffed at him earlier was now scrolling through his phone, muttering under his breath. Elijah could feel the stares, but he wasn't bothered anymore. Something was happening, and it wasn't in their favor, it was in his. A few moments passed, and the flight attendant came back, walking briskly down the aisle. She avoided Elijah's gaze, her face a mixture of guilt and confusion. She had clearly been given new instructions, but it wasn't hard to tell that she wasn't happy about them. The supervisor reappeared shortly after, his expression no longer serious but more anxious. He walked past Elijah without saying a word, glancing briefly at the other passengers who were still eyeing him with curiosity. Then, to Elijah's surprise, the captain entered the cabin again. This time, there was a different energy about him. He was no longer the calm, neutral figure. Now, he looked almost worried. Elijah wasn't sure what was happening, but he could tell things were escalating. The captain stopped near Elijah's seat. "Excuse me, young man," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of caution. Elijah turned his head to face him, feeling a new wave of uncertainty. "Yes?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rush of thoughts swirling in his mind. "I need to apologize on behalf of the airline. We've just been informed that there's been some confusion," the captain said, choosing his words carefully. "You are, of course, more than welcome to stay in first class." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "I never left," he said softly but firmly. The captain nodded, taking a deep breath as if preparing to say something difficult. "We've received instructions from the top," he continued, his voice low. "The misunderstanding earlier was not your fault, Elijah. In fact, it was a matter of protocol and a lack of understanding from the staff." Elijah was still trying to piece everything together. Why was the captain telling him all this now? Before Elijah could ask any more questions, the captain leaned in slightly. "I'm sure you've realized by now that your father is the owner of this airline." Elijah felt his breath catch in his throat. He had no idea how the captain could have known. His father's name wasn't something Elijah often used, especially not around strangers. "Yes," the captain continued, his voice lowering further. "Your father owns this airline, and it's his decision to ensure that you are treated with the respect you deserve. We've made some mistakes today, and I assure you, they won't happen again." Elijah's eyes widened as everything started to make sense. His father had found out, and now the airline was acting swiftly to correct the wrong. It was a strange feeling. One part relief, one part confusion. The captain straightened up, his expression softening. "I just wanted you to know that this situation is being handled, and we'll make sure this never happens again." Elijah nodded slowly. He felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. His father owned the airline, and now people were scrambling to make things right. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an awkward reminder that some people still judged others based on things they couldn't control. The flight attendant returned moments later with a new tray of drinks, this time with a smile. She placed a glass of juice in front of Elijah. "On behalf of the airline, "Please accept this as a token of our apology," she said, her voice more polite than before. Elijah glanced at her but didn't speak. The entire situation still felt surreal. It was all happening so fast. But one thing was clear. His father's influence had turned the tide. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Elijah's thoughts remained deep in contemplation. He had always known his father was influential, but today had revealed a side of the world he hadn't fully understood. The power his father held was undeniable, but Elijah wasn't sure how he felt about it. On one hand, it had shielded him from an embarrassing situation. On the other, it made him think about the people who didn't have someone to stand up for them. His eyes drifted toward the window once again, the clouds outside forming soft layers as the plane cut through them. For the first time in a while, he felt a little disconnected from everything. The event earlier had made him question so many things, but he wasn't sure what the right answers were yet. The flight attendants had settled into their routine, moving up and down the aisle, making small talk with passengers, offering snacks, and refilling drinks. Elijah could tell that the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What had started as an uncomfortable tension was now a quiet normalcy, people going about their business, ignoring the strange scene that had unfolded earlier. Some passengers even tried to engage in casual conversation, as though nothing had happened, but Elijah wasn't in the mood to talk. It wasn't long before the woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had come to his defense, approached him. She was walking down the aisle, but as she passed, she stopped for a moment and smiled warmly at him. "Hey there," she said in a gentle voice. "I just wanted to say you handled that situation with a lot of grace. Not everyone would have been able to stay as calm as you did." Elijah felt a small wave of gratitude. "Thanks," he said, his voice steady. "It wasn't easy, but I had to stand my ground." She nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. Sometimes people try to make assumptions, and it can be tough to push back. I'm glad you did." They exchanged a few more words, and Elijah appreciated the conversation. It was rare to have a stranger take the time to recognize what he had been through and offer words of encouragement. Most people just go along with what they're told, but this woman had shown empathy. As she walked back to her seat, Elijah's mind wandered to his family. His mother had been right to stand by him when he needed it, but it was his father's involvement that had brought the situation to an end so swiftly. Elijah didn't know if he wanted that kind of power in his own life, though. It seemed like it could easily be misused, and today he had seen how quickly people could make judgments based on something as simple as a ticket. He thought back to the businessman, the one who had made snide remarks about Elijah's place in first class. Elijah had felt angry at first, but now he felt pity. The man had acted out of ignorance, not knowing who Elijah really was. It wasn't his fault. He had just been a product of the world that had taught him to judge without understanding. Elijah couldn't change how people like him thought, but he could choose not to let it define his own sense of self-worth. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from his mother. "How are you doing, son? I hope you're okay." Elijah smiled at the simple message. It wasn't filled with drama or complicated explanations. It was just a mother checking in on her son. And in that moment, he realized something important. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. Not to the businessman, not to the flight attendants, not even to the world. He knew who he was. The flight continued smoothly, and as the hours passed, Elijah relaxed. He spent the rest of the journey reflecting on the lessons he had learned. No matter how many challenges he faced, no matter how many people doubted him, he would stand strong. He wouldn't let others dictate his worth, and he certainly wouldn't let their assumptions shape his future. By the time the plane began its descent, Elijah felt a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't about the first-class seat or his father's connections. It was about finding his own voice and using it to make sure he was treated fairly, just like everyone else.